and today we have an awesome new guest named Justin Roczniak. Did I say your name right, Justin?
Yes, you got it right the first time. Excellent.
All right, all right. It looks like it's harder to pronounce than it actually is. And the reason that we have Justin on is that, as listeners may have noticed from the last episode, the main theme was the nuclear family. And in the conversation about nuclear family, we ended up talking a little bit about single family homes, the suburbs, and the kind of built environment that reinforces some of the social organizational aspects that kind of keeps the nuclear family uh, intact, or maybe not so intact based off of what we talked about. So we actually reached out to Justin because he's a civil engineer, uh, built environment kind of expert person, and we thought that getting his brain applied to some of these concepts would be really fun and really interesting and far beyond our ability to think in this way, since we're mental health people. We're not like engineers.
Yeah,
So yeah.
I'm the guy who knows about buildings. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Um, so what the hell is a single family home and why was it built? Why do we have them in our cities?
That's a good place to start. A single family home, is it's a house. It's what we think of as a house, right? One family lives in there. You got mom, dad, 2.5 kids, 1.6 cars, a dog and a half. I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a cat. Um, and it sits on a 1/4 acre lot, and there's 50 of them on one street, and it's 40 miles away from the city where dad works, right? That's your sort of popular conception of a single family house. And in almost all of the country, it's the only kind of housing that's legal to build.
Really?
Wow.
What happens if you wanted to build co-housing?
Oh, they'd say you can't do that.
Okay.
So
the legislature is right behind that concept.
it's that, but it's more local zoning codes than anything else. Like you're looking at these zoning codes that exist throughout so much of the United States basically say, they regulate the massing, the size of a building, they regulate the size of a lot, they regulate all kinds of stuff. But the number one thing that they really go for is you can only build single family housing in so much of the United States.
I'm curious as to whether that always was so, or whether the McCarthyite decision not to have collective housing because it was communist and not to build up the cities but the suburbs with isolated housing was what basically determined that decision.
So there's sort of there's a history before like McCarthy and the suburbs of I guess a tendency towards single family housing. If you go back to, let's say, the late, once the railroads started building out from cities, you started to get railroad suburbs, right? These are like your early sort of little towns. They're next to the railroad. You take the commuter train into work. You'd have, some apartments next to the station. You'd have some larger houses on small lots, just outside of that, right? And then from that, after that, you had like streetcar suburbs. That's a place where I live in West Philly, which is a lot of row houses. You had single family housing before, but the modern conception of it really doesn't come about until, I would say, maybe the 1890s, early 1900s, where we have sort of Ebenezer Howard's garden cities and stuff like that. You'd have these single family houses, and they weren't the norm. People still very much lived in either a row house or apartment blocks usually. But moving on from that, I put down some notes here. I should look at them. You start to see the roots of this single family housing come about with the rise of the mass automobile ownership and a Supreme Court case called Euclid versus Ambler. That was the city of Euclid outside of Cleveland, Ohio. versus Ambler Realty Company. And the city of Euclid said was trying to regulate land use so that Ambler Realty could not build a factory in their town, right? And what they said was this plot of land that Ambler Realty owned, you could only build single family houses here. And Ambler Realty sued them. It got to the Supreme Court. The village Euclid won out, and that was where we get this idea, this conception that towns can zone land for certain uses, as opposed to it just being the right of the property owner to build whatever the hell they want. So after that, from there, lots of towns adopt zoning codes, and a lot of them are closely modeled off of Euclid's, because it's some of this was kind of done without like rhyme or reason or thought. They just look at the next municipality over and say, let's copy that code. And after this, you have the more conscious decisions come later with the Federal Housing Authority to only invest in single family housing and not in urban housing. But the seeds of it were there beforehand.
Well, I guess the history of the family is a history of a nuclear family with maybe a relative or so on, but the mother, father, children. And without a community sense of building communal housing. Is that correct, or am I off on that? That was my understanding in terms of family history.
Well, I wonder where, like, I don't know if this synthesizes it, but like where the intersection of the history of like single family homes in towns, as like towns kind of evolved around, like you're describing, Justin, the like railroad towns to automobiles and everything, to like, I mean, I don't know if, Harriet, if this is what you're touching on, but like sort of that 1950s sort of fantasy dream of just like the two kids and the 1.5 dogs or whatever, just like where those two histories intersect. I don't know if that's what you're kind of touching on or if that's something
Yeah,
else.
it is. I'm touching on where that 1950s anti-communist, anti-communal energy comes into the housing in the United States.
I mean, I wonder if that's like the history of the suburbs, essentially.
Yeah, it sounds like it, but this is
Yeah.
an area where we really need Justin's wisdom.
So I'm
Yeah,
thinking, I mean, this is sort of something which was manufactured out of whole cloth, essentially. Because there wasn't really, the suburbs were supposed to be, this is, you live on your house, you have like a whole, maybe a quarter acre of space, you have a lawn, you have all this stuff, it's the American dream. And this was encouraged financially, right? Because the government would invest in housing outside of cities, but not in them. And part of that was, the allure of homeownership and the sort of the financialization of it, right? Because pretty early on, these single family houses, their primary function was not actually housing people. It's, it's an investment, right? Because the housing, the value of housing only goes up. So, you sell it at some point and then that's your retirement fund.
Why was that the dream in a town rather than a cooperative dream in a town? How did that get going before the 1950s? Because the 1950s, it was a direct anti-communist propaganda move. But what about before then?
Before then, so there were, there's early 1900s, there's a lot of problems with cities, right? Density was a bigger problem back then than it is now because, the cities were kind of dirty and nasty, right?
Yeah.
Because you're still transporting everything with horses, right? So there's poop everywhere.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily, a lot of buildings didn't necessarily have electricity. A lot of them didn't even have running water. Sanitation was a big problem. Everything's smelly and nasty. So, there were views that, we need to build and this was pioneered by Ebenezer Howard. We need, to build like garden cities, right? And these would be, out in the open countryside. There'd be like lots of trees. There'd be lots of open spaces, stuff like that. And this would, alleviate some of the miseries associated with urban living. And only a couple of those got built, but they sort of served as the model for how the suburbs would be developed. Lots of open space, lots of green, lots of big lawns, stuff like that. Um,
Hmm.
and of course, once you start solving a lot of the problems with cities, the cars got rid of the horses. If you put, plumbing in all the buildings, you put electricity in, there's still a mystique associated with, moving out to the suburbs even then.
So I actually forget this. This is definitely revealing my ignorance, but that suburbs and cities aren't necessarily, well, they're not the same thing. That suburbs tend to be on the outskirts of city. Like you have the sort of city core and then you build suburbs outside of the city. I mean, is that, I know this sounds so ignorant to, I'm actually naming something that was probably obvious to most people. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so from there, so I'm also thinking like the social function of this then is um so families and presumably workers, like I guess, I mean, are suburbs considered like more workforce housing or not necessarily?
It depends on the suburb. I mean, there's
Okay.
rich suburbs, there's poor suburbs, there's working class suburbs, there's
Hmm.
there's suburbs which are like ethnic neighborhoods. There's,
Right.
it's more like, how do I want to say this? I mean, some suburbs definitely have workforce housing it to them, but some, do not.
Mhm.
So it's more like the city is where like work happens, and then the suburbs are where, well, workers and I guess consumers, like trying to just, under capitalism, live in between going to the places of work and consumption, I guess.
Oh
Right?
yeah, and
Like in just
you're
in the, yeah, in the social functionality of it, yeah, of the design. Okay.
So the suburbs are where family is supposed to thrive because
Hmm.
there's an idea of that the city is evil and the
oh yeah.
country is positive.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's just interesting because at the turn of the century, those 200 utopian communities that were trying to create socialism and equality by creating a utopian community all had the idea that they should be centrally located, but they were socialists and they were trying to do something different. And then, in what I'm aware of, now maybe that's just because of my limited awareness, was that it was in the 50s that they were trying to encourage women to get out of the workforce to make room for the GIs, and the suburbs as a non cooperative environment so that communist roots of cooperation could be rooted out. Now, I don't know whether that is really right or that's the impression that I got. What do you
That
think, Justin?
that sounds about right to me, because like once you get your post-war suburb is fundamentally a different animal than a pre-war suburb, right?
Mm,
Um, after World War II, of course, now everyone's got cars. Cars are like reliable. You're not driving around an old broken down jalopy. You start building the interstate highway network, which means everyone can drive very quickly everywhere, and that means I can start building suburbs way out in the boondocks, right? Um, and you start moving away from, let's say, sort of a grid based suburb, something where you've got some houses that are on small sort of lots, right? Maybe you have a store on the corner. Maybe you have, you have sidewalks. It's possible to walk places, right? Your kids can maybe walk to school. You start moving into something where everyone's got a house on a quarter acre of land. You've got, you may be 3 or 4 miles away from a store, and it's just the same house
right.
plopped down over and over again.
Yeah.
And
Like,
the roads are set up so that, the idea is you don't have through traffic. So, you only have local traffic driving around. But that also means you have lots of cul-de-sacs, you have lots of dead ends, and you wind up with situations where, you may have to drive a couple miles to go 300 feet as the crow flies.
yeah,
Uh,
that makes sense because I do remember that Levittown, built after World War II for white veterans, you weren't allowed to have black friends over. You weren't allowed to have more than two children. You had to buy your appliances from GE, and you had to have a dependent wife and children and a wage earning male in that enforced 1950s family. But I wonder, that I know about Levittown, but I don't know whether that were everywhere. Was that everywhere?
There were definitely a lot of like racial covenants and stuff like that, especially in the 1950s. I mean, this was definitely, suburbs were definitely a place for white people and white people only, preferably. And it could range from some places it was only for white Protestants. Some
Mm.
places, this is it's sort of a this is you're trying to get away from the big nasty city where my God, black people live, and
Mm. Yeah.
and they start systemic disinvestment in cities right after this through like redlining and stuff like that, where
Yeah.
banks will absolutely refuse to grant loans for improvements to any kind of buildings in certain neighborhoods or buildings of a certain size or whatever.
Well,
Yeah.
I wonder too, like, so based on that, like from an investment perspective, if you have like, okay, like in the inner city, and like usually the term inner city, there's usually like a sort of racialized and class
Mm.
set of assumptions like built into even the term inner city. It's not really a place-based term, even though maybe like planners use it in that way. But like the inner city housing development schemes are typically going to be like more in the the disinvestment range, unless there's like hardcore gentrification going on, I would assume. But in the suburbs, well, I mean, you are saying there's lower to high, there's a range of suburbs, but I think in the Levitt town, sort of like white single family home, and like just get a bunch of the 2.5 dog dream thing, all of that was also it was couched within like an investment, like a real estate investment scheme. I mean, it wasn't as advanced as it is now, where they, like the machine is so well greased now. It was just sort of like you were saying, you can like retire and it'll be the investment that you, like whether you're going to rent it out to somebody else or whatever, but it was still like an investment. And I guess like all that said, I wonder to what degree there was an investment idea behind, like, let's say if you just copy paste a whole bunch of single family homes throughout these like big grids outside of a city, if it was this thought that like the more of these single units or these single homes that you can copy paste, that's just more units to extract value from versus like enormous co-housing
Mm.
or cooperative owned or like community land trust owned developments, right, where like that wouldn't be as much of an investment, like you couldn't extract value from it so much, right, because the value would actually sort of recirculate within the community ownership, like, or if it were publicly owned, that's like a whole thing too. But that's just kind of where my mind's going. I mean, do you think that the single family home like suburb copy paste phenomenon was like evolved out of a desire for the real estate industry to just like extract more profits, or was it too early then for that machine to have evolved to where it's at now?
I think there's two things here which sort of underscore I guess the anti-communist brilliance of the suburban model.
Mm.
So your real estate developers make a real quick profit off of these. They build the house, they sell it, they walk away, right? No problem. Now what you've done is you've taken, maybe you bought, like, you're a working class person, you bought a house, it might be a kind of modest one, a little cheap. What you've done is you've now turned that working class person into a person who has a vested interest in the
Mm.
performance of the real estate market, right? Uh,
Mm.
so suddenly
Huh.
you start caring about your property value because this is your nest egg here is your house. Um,
Mm.
you start saying, well, if they start building communal housing or something like that, now that's going to drop the value of my house because housing won't be as scarce, right?
Hmm.
So what you've done is you take ordinary people and you turn them into kulaks through single family housing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I never quite thought of that, but once because you might sort of get yourself into the home ownership position in a suburb in this single family home copy paste model, and you're just doing it because you're like you're saying you're an ordinary person. You don't want to pay rent to a shitty landlord for the rest of your life, and you say, well, we're going to put down payments and own a home, and we happen to be of a racial and class position where we can actually do this. Cool, great. And you get one or two generations down the line, and now you have, I mean, probably millions of Americans at this point who are doing exactly what you just described. They're saying, okay, we need to make sure our lawns look a certain way, everything
Mm.
is kept up really nice. We have to repaint every so often, um, just in the name of essentially keeping up with the Joneses down the street, so that we're all sort of collectively. This is actually a weird collective idea, but we're collectively um, upping the values of the homes, sort of in not even necessarily in service of ourselves, even though, because yeah, it'll up the resale value if we sell it or something, or if we start to like rent units in the back. But this is all kind of in service of the real estate industry on a certain level, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Um,
it turns regular rational people into into the president of the homeowners association fining people $100 for having the trash bin in the wrong spot.
Right.
wow,
Now,
yeah, huh? Never thought of that.
Justin, if most people's biggest investment is in their home, how does the reverse mortgage then affect the next generation of young people who are already disenfranchised?
Hmm.
How big is that effect?
Oh
Because
God,
as
someone's going to have to remind me how a reverse mortgage works. I
a
never quite
reverse
understood it.
mortgage
Hmm.
is, you promise the bank your house and they support you till you die and your kids get nothing.
Oh, okay, right, yes.
So if you don't have the cash to keep up that house and have it look like it should, and you don't, the bank will do that. And the bank, of course, they don't do that with a 25-year-old. They do that with an older person who they can count on dying sooner. The bank will support the house and you until you die. And then the bank owns the house, and the working class kid who might have gotten something gets nothing.
Well, and I've actually, just to jump in, and what I've heard is that this is the new, so like in for the Main Street, Main Street versus Wall Street, there's this thing called like the gray tsunami that the sort of, the housing, the worker co-op development people are talking about, which is some enormous chunk of, well, this is pre-COVID, at least now it's just probably a total nightmare, but most small business owners on Main Street are going to be retiring. And so there's this big push to say, well, why don't we sell it to our workers so they can convert it to worker co-ops? I think there's kind of a similar phenomenon probably happening, and that there's this massive number of older homeowners, like boomers, who are like, as you're describing, the old dream was, oh, well, you just pass it down to your kids, right? And
Mm-hmm.
part of this investment, it was financial, but it was like familial, right? It was going to be like
Right.
an investment for the intergenerationality of my family. But what you're describing is that there's this newer phenomenon. I wonder how widespread this is, right? Like where you're not passing it down through your family, you're passing it up to the bank, right?
Right.
I mean, is that the
And
new norm? I mean, Justin, do you know if is that just the way it is now, like typically, or does it just vary? I mean,
I mean, I am not.
you better be an expert on everything, damn it.
Yeah, I know, right?
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
super. I'm not super familiar with how like suburban housing is trending right now. I do know that like lots of
Hmm.
young people they don't want to buy these suburban McMansions.
No.
No one
Yeah.
wants these things. They're like crappy. Like
Mm-hmm.
they a lot of them are falling apart already, especially the early generation of McMansions. Because the
Hmm.
1990s sort of era suburbs, there was a huge building boom then, and they all were built out of these sort of engineered lumber, uh, flimsy McMansions, with very short lifespans, all things considered. Um, I don't know if we'll see like a total collapse in the suburban housing market, but I don't know that. I don't know necessarily that these houses are going to keep holding their value.
Yeah, well, what
Right.
I'm worried about is that as young people are increasingly disenfranchised since the mid 70s, their jobs have been outsourced, mechanized, computerized, and they don't have much of a future. The one thing they used to have was the family home, but with reverse mortgages, they're not getting that either. But that, I don't know how widespread that is, but it's a further disenfranchisement of the American
Mhm.
working class, white and black, because there were black segregated suburbs built after a while in Long Island. I forget what the one is called, but they were determinedly segregated. But because white GIs after World War II got government mortgages and could buy these little boxes, there was a demand, and then blacks got the same little boxes or similar boxes in segregated neighborhoods. But now, what I'm thinking about is that as capitalism has disenfranchised young people, their families are doing that too. Is that true? And that's what I'm wondering about, how, if you know how
Mm.
widespread that is and what effect it has, because then the American dream of the little house is gone.
Well, I wonder. This never occurred to me before, but to what degree the suburbs and the single family home 1950s 2.5 dogs dream was on some level a divide and conquer strategy. Uh, in that you could separate tons of people who maybe in another built environment, structural context, would have been more incentivized to maybe not act in some super utopian, hippy dippy collectivized magic, unicorn fashion, but maybe there would have been more of a degree of togetherness versus like, let's stay very separate and just
Mm,
be in our families, and not really, maybe talk to the neighbors, probably not really talk to the neighbors, just keep to yourself, do your work, save your money, invest. And then now what we're seeing is this evolution of like, not only had people already been so just segregated across the individual units of families, but as they passed, um, it was supposed to be passing down to the kids. But now, if the kids aren't even able to get it, I mean, if you think from a real estate industry perspective, this all along would have actually been pretty nice divide and conquer strategy, and that you just divided up so many people across so many different physical aspects of the built environment so that you
mm,
could extract value from them, so that they couldn't ever come together and decide like what actually would be a better way for us to do this so that
yeah,
we don't completely screw over our grandkids. How do we prevent our grandkids from getting screwed from this model, right? Because there's still it sounds like the real estate industry is still going to benefit at the end of the day no matter what happens,
yes,
because
Yeah.
they're going to ultimately own everything.
right.
And even if there's a collapse or whatever, once all the prices are depressed, and then they say, oh good, well then, like Justin was just saying, let's just build a shit ton more somewhere. Now
Hmm.
that the prices are so low, we'll find somebody that can buy all this crap, and we'll just start over, right? That'll be their strategy, and they'll still
Yeah,
own everything. So
and another feeder stream into the same ideas that we've been talking about and that I'm concerned about is gender, because the burbs were built to enforce the gender norm of the 50s, that the woman is to stay home and the man is to be the sole provider, and transportation was the car. And that has really affected the divorce rate and the problems of suburbs, because everyone has to work now to make less than a white male used to earn. And I wonder what's going on there in terms of gender in the suburbs,
mm.
just because I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
Justin, give us all the answers.
Yeah.
Quick.
This is why you're here.
So I think it can't be overestimated how much the sort of the private automobile sort of locks people into
Mm,
living situations and
yeah.
relationships, right? Because you're you move away from a situation where, okay, I can walk out of the house, I can walk down the street, I can get away from stuff, I can be back. Kids can't go anywhere anymore.
Mm,
um you know
Mhm.
because you need a car to go literally anywhere. And
mm,
this is enforced through the way we design roads. This is enforced through just sheer distance. I mean, Even if somewhere is close enough to walk to, people give you funny looks. I mean, my
Mm.
mom used to try and walk me to elementary school when I was a kid, and the administration kept yelling at her about it. So you can't walk your kid to school. You got to drive a quarter of a mile. You can't walk.
Yeah, well,
Mm,
that was when what was good for General Motors was good for the country,
mm,
or at least that's what General Motors said. But
mm,
what I'm curious about is within the majority of marriages collapsing and the huge burgeoning number of 42% of kids growing up with one parent and 75% without their biological two parents. How does the suburbs manage since it was built on such gender segregation? What's
mm.
happening now?
I People are getting up very early to drive their
Yeah,
kid to school. Is what's happening.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because suddenly, yeah, both parents are working. They might have two separate commutes. Everyone's got to drive more cars. The kids have to fend for themselves, or you got to pay for daycare or extended care after school. The
Mhm,
the system just does not work as well. The suburban system with
mm,
on a two income family, it's not designed to do it, and people are just sort of coping. You're spending longer and longer hours doing more and more commuting, and
mm.
you may be driving an hour each way to get to work, and you're dropping the kids off, and then later on you have to, like, I don't know, uh you might have to bring them to sports practice or some kind of other crap. It puts a lot of work on people.
Mm.
Well, and when I think about the amount of time, right? Like, so I just my car's not passing smog, and I mean it's kind of like a older used crappy car that I'm just gonna have to sell for parts most likely, and then see how much I can do like the bike and bus thing from now on. But when I think of like people, so here in Santa Barbara, people have to go. The gentrification thing has made it so families have been pushed out like 1 to 2 hour commutes just to come have their normal crappy job here, and then it's like why even do it here anymore? But then they have to go back out. I know in the Bay Area where I grew up, it's like nobody actually lives in. I don't want to say nobody lives in San Francisco anymore, but it's like if you work in San Francisco, you probably live in like San Jose, which is like a 2 hour or 1 to 2 hour drive. This I've heard this is just happening all over the country where everyone's getting pushed out. So not only do you have to go find a more affordable home, and let's say you're doing the mortgage homeowner thing, and what you're saying, Justin, is because or as what you often say, Harriet, is the white single male wage was enough. Now you have to have both parents. But when you actually think about the maintenance and the repairs, the registration, the DMV crap you have to do just to have two cars, let's say you have two cars, like that's just so much of a time suck, plus the commuting, and like you're saying, Justin, with the daycare. I mean, at a certain point, I think when we talk about the collapse of marriage, and this is sort of just occurring to me, it could be that like Americans have had so many extra things piled on over time that they started to seem like smaller things, but now it's like there's just too much damn paperwork to get done and stuff like that, that you
Yep.
just like can't like get along with the people you live with. You know what I mean? Like you
Mhm.
can't actually have good relationships anymore because you're like, I'm 5,000 tasks behind. It's Thursday at 9 a.m. and by 10 a.m. there's 5,000 more tasks I'm gonna have to get done just to make ends meet and just to get the kids to school or whatever, you know. And all of this does seem to be couched somewhat in the built environment and in the way that if suburbia and the single family home was designed initially to be relatively close to where you might have to go to do the work to get the money to pay the mortgage or whatever. Now you have to have two cars there. Now it has to be way further away from where you work. And since public transportation and everything else that was, I mean, I don't know if it was ever good. It probably depends on what city you're in. But with all those things kind of collapsing around us, you could just see the stress building up kind of exponentially, like to the degree that the system is sort of failing everyone. Like our stress levels are probably following that exact curve, if that makes sense, you know.
Yeah, and I
And then
think
there's
our
more
divorce
family
too.
violence and blah blah blah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and more
Divorce.
divorce because I read an article that said the poorest places in America are now the suburbs. They have the most poor people.
Oh
I
wow.
don't know if that's true, but I could see why it would be and why you'd be trapped. When people are
Mm-hmm.
trapped with COVID at home and home is untenable, you can just see the whole thing fall apart.
Well, what if we like shifted? We obviously don't have like absolutely perfect solutions, but like since we
Hmm.
have Justin and Justin has all the answers, like to
Thank you.
everything, like literally
Yes.
to everything. Um,
Yes.
I mean, some things that come to mind to me. I remember I felt so inspired actually watching your video, Justin, on oh, I don't even think we mentioned this. So Justin's YouTube name is donoteat01. Everyone should
Yes.
check out his
Yeah.
videos. He uses this video game called City Skylines, which is like it's like you're building fake cities, and it's like
Hmm.
Yeah.
it's really interesting to just watch him do it. But he created this sort of political series, and well, a number of series. But one of my favorites is just the one on gentrification that you made, because
Mm.
when you broke down how it all
Mine
works and you
too.
actually show in the built environment, like you're building this thing and that thing and saying, and then once this is here and this price goes up, then all the people here have to leave and they physically have to go out further from this urban core. At a certain point, you started mentioning all these kind of solutions. They're just policy things. It was like what I remember from memory is rent control, vacancy taxes,
Hmm.
right to first refusal laws, just cause eviction. Man, I think I got almost all of them. Community land trust, cooperative ownership of buildings.
Mm.
I'm probably missing a couple of them,
Yeah.
but I mean, but just those kinds of things. There's probably other things we could expand. Oh, high quality public housing. Do you think if we got like those kinds of policies overnight, it would would that be it? Is there more that we have to do to reverse this nightmarish trend of, you know, housing falling apart everywhere for everybody? Like what kinds of built environment and policy solutions do we need to fix this stuff?
Well, I feel like one of the things is a lot of the policies I mentioned there. There's some stuff which I think is really good, pretty permanent solutions like building a lot of public housing. Right,
Yeah.
that's one
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm.
I think a lot of these problems will be under a lot of policies can they'll be sort of undermined by
Yes.
the existence of this concept that is so sacred in America, which is homeownership. Um,
Hmm.
it's an incredibly effective tool for turning people into right wing shitheads. That was Thatcher's strategy, was privatizing all the public housing, and the Tories have done extremely well after that. Um, it's there has to be some kind of reckoning at some point with the fact that your single family house is first and foremost a store of wealth and not a place for you to live.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then I think to myself, they must have gotten people to think there must have been a big propaganda effort. There certainly was after World War II to make the individual suburban house the best place to have a family, to raise children, and to live. So, what
Hmm.
kind of propaganda effort would you need to help people understand that they need each other, and that maybe taking care of your own is not just your own family and house, but taking care of your own species?
Hmm.
How did they get people into this idea that home ownership meant you'd arrived in the world, and how did they get them out of it?
Oh, I was like, well, the first time around, it helped that the suburbs were new, right? Everything was
Hmm.
new. You had new roads, you had new schools, you had new houses, you had new, other social services. Everything was new. It was very convenient. Nothing was old and busted yet, right?
Yeah.
And everything in the city was old and busted.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so that helped, and all you had to do is put up a poster of I got a big shiny car, I got a lawn, I got a wife. I don't think it took too much convincing, and also it was very cheap to live in the suburbs. There was a lot of subsidization going on by the Federal Housing Administration.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That's
Well,
important.
so when I think of like public housing versus say community land trust and housing co-ops, I think of like, public housing is sort of, quote unquote big government owns the housing. I mean, that's not, that's just how people perceive it sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, and then, a community land trust or a network of cooperatively owned structures can just be like, you know, like 10 people that like serve on different boards or something like that, like deliberate on crap, right? And they're just like community members. They're not like they're not state officials or whatever.
Yeah.
um I mean, do you think, like, I'm realizing as I'm saying this at scale, I mean, could like community land trust replace the need for like a large public housing effort, or do you really think like you need a strong kind of state push for like massive public housing investment, or do you think that more decentralized, CLT housing co-op thing could do the same trick?
Well, I mean, you would eventually be getting to community housing trusts, which are big enough that they're capable of putting up a 20 or 30-story building. I mean, at which point
Mm,
I think the state could achieve it more expediently. I mean, I also
mm,
think
mhm.
to some extent, if you just change the zoning, uh, I hate to say the private market could fill a lot of holes like immediately, but it
Mm,
could. um,
mm.
but
Mm.
the where am I going with this? Uh, you know, I don't know if these institutions are quite there now. I don't know if the
Mm.
public housing
Mm.
system is quite there either right now. I mean,
Right.
it was never really building,
Mm.
new housing. That's one of the problems with early public housing is it was more of a replacement of existing substandard housing than it was any new housing.
Well, that's where, I mean, my frustration when I've gotten a little bit I've dipped into like work on this and just finding that, I mean, where I live, the housing authority is just pitiful, right? They're so underfunded, like because of austerity over the last 50 years or whatever. The amount of money, I mean, the wait lists are just insanely high for section, every sort of like subsidy, which I guess, that's different than public housing, but I think of it as like the same general problem, which is that there's no funding, right, for like public anything, let alone housing. And so I could see why some people just say like, well, let's just get a bunch of people to somehow um, do the housing co-op CLT thing, so that we don't have to work with this crappy, never-endingly terrible state structure that keeps getting,
Mm.
it's like Republicans will make a shitty law, and then the Democrats will come in and not do anything good,
Mm.
and it's like, well, what do we do, right? So, I mean, even in that context, it's like, what, um, and I don't know, I'm sure there's so many weird wonky things out there from municipal, state to federal, but like I'm half assuming that to like really do this well for like the public housing thing, you'd need federal level, you'd need a Bernie person, right, in the federal, and appointing a ton of people into the federal realm. I wonder if like state can do it, but like, wouldn't you just need like a really good sort of like socialist president, to
You'd
be able to
need,
fork over the
Yeah,
level of money needed
yeah.
for like public to actually do public housing, right?
I think you'd need not only public money, but you'd need to change people's consciousness. Because one of the
Mm,
problems with a lot of New York City public housing is it's a collection of desperate people who will never go anywhere
mm,
and therefore do not maintain the housing. Whereas in New
mm,
Haven, where I used to live, they had public housing, but everybody had responsibility. It was a sort of group of row houses. Everyone had responsibilities. You had to sweep, you had to take
mm,
out garbage, you had to do this. And if you didn't, your
mhm.
neighbors were down on you.
Huh.
And but most of the people that lived there then were saving for their own house. So
Oh.
they were living temporarily in public housing with an eye to moving on. And you wonder
Mm,
what kind of ideology you would need so that people could see it as theirs and as theirs collectively and responsibly theirs. That it would seem like that would be totally necessary rather than rip it off because you're getting ripped off anyway and you've given up hope.
well, and that's where like when you talk about the 1950s propaganda stuff, it's like it's hard for
Mm.
me to imagine. Like, I mean, so if you think of all those like stupid posters of like the, you know bright-eyed white family in their nice new car and stuff, and like,
Mm.
here's their home, right? Like, that was the kind of stuff. I mean, what I mean. Okay, here, all right, guys, here's our working group. We'll bring it back to the general meeting next week. What what would it actually look like to create propaganda that says that you have like multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, queer, like, the most intersectional imagery as you can, saying like public housing now, right? Like, family, you got like weird family, you got multi-generational families saying like, we want public housing now. I mean, would that work, right?
You'd have to
Like
redefine public housing so that people wouldn't think they're going into a hopeless project that's
Yeah.
being
yeah,
allowed
yeah,
to deteriorate.
Right.
the way the New York City Housing Authority allows. You'd really
It
have
just seems,
to say it's cooperative housing or something like that rather than just
yeah.
public housing.
I mean, the other crappy thing is like nobody, like everybody knows what a damn single family, like everybody knows what, like, I could be a homeowner and own a home in a suburb. Like everybody knows what that means now. It's just, you don't have to explain it to everybody, to
No,
anybody. Most people have no idea what any of the things we're talking about. Like public housing is associated with like poverty and destitution.
right,
Yep.
Community land trust is a term nobody knows, has
right,
any idea what that is. Housing cooperatives, some people kind of know. It sounds like hippie, but like no, like, I
right.
mean, I feel like if you're in New York or like a lot of places in Canadian cities, you kind of know what it is, but like nobody else knows what it is. So like just the concepts of these like alternative or like co-housing, right? It was like get
Right.
rid of your fences in a neighborhood, and now you have this, like, that kind of thing. That's also like, so it's like 0.001% of Americans are even doing it. So I guess that's the frustration I'm hitting, and the thinking about this, like, how the hell, where do you even start, right?
I don't know who you target for this sort of propaganda. That's the other thing,
Right,
because
right,
there's definitely like a lot of people who would absolutely take public housing if it were offered. Because these waiting lists for public housing authorities are incredibly long everywhere. I don't even know you need too much of a
right.
propaganda campaign. The
Sure,
housing is
sure.
there; people will use it. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're like years long waiting lists. That's
yeah,
true.
But
I guess
how
the
do you
trick is
keep
how do you get it built? That's the real question.
also, how do you
Mm-hmm.
get the people that are there to see it as theirs and therefore cooperate in maintaining and celebrating that connectedness, which you have in co housing because that's the point of living in co housing. But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it, I, it seems to me that people's associations with public housing are dead end and
Mm-hmm.
not possibilities for collectivity because partly the left really abandoned those ideas about housing and family and so on. And the right wing has pushed this individualist idea of success as individual success, and looking out for your own as looking out only for your own family, if not only your own self. So,
One, maybe one glimmer of hope when I think of like the Moms for Housing. That I'm thinking like L.A., Oakland, wasn't it Philly actually, Justin? There's been a sort of like groundswell movement, especially I think during COVID, it's been really amplified. But like poorer, typically, I think like largely women of color with like moms with like kids, basically occupying vacant homes,
Yes.
risking arrest, getting arrested, like pretty high, very kind of like
yeah,
higher risk direct action kind of
right,
stuff. Usually working in coalitions that include militant tenants unions, the boring policy wonk people that are on the CLT, and that kind of stuff. But they're doing these really large pushes to just say like, you know what, fuck this. We're taking the vacant homes.
right,
We're
Yeah.
just going to live in them. We know, and we're going to be public about it. We're not squatting quietly. We're actually just saying, hey, we're
hmm
here and we're taking it, and you can't have it
right,
anymore. And then they're forcing conversations, um, within like large, really well organized networks of people who are then pushing for policy, um, and I think it was Philly. Correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, but didn't they just, this was like on Democracy Now and stuff? Is like they got the city to somehow, I don't know if it was eminent domain or what. They just forked over like 50 vacant properties to the community land trust. Was
So
that Philly?
most of those houses were owned by the Philadelphia Housing Authority. They were what they
Oh,
call scattered sites houses, because at some point in the 90s, the housing authority bought a whole bunch of row houses with the
mhm,
intention that they would sort of rent them as public housing, right? And then they
mhm.
just sat on them for 30 years and didn't do anything.
oh, so they
Um,
Wow.
deteriorated.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I was I actually, as part of a job a while back, I was inspecting some of them. They some of them were fine, and others you'd open the door and there was no house behind the door.
Mm, that, yeah,
Well, that goes back to the like, see, that's a situation where I can see the tension between kind of CLT and public is like they were saying like, well, the public housing thing isn't working out so good, so let's just kind of take it back, like that more
Yeah,
maybe anarchistic spirit of like we're going to take it ourselves kind of thing. It seems like an appropriate application of that. If I would assume they probably tried to get something done with the city and just got or maybe the housing authority was just, it was incompetent leadership, or I don't know. I don't know the situation, but
There is an attitude problem at PHA. I can tell you that much.
Yeah.
okay.
They don't
Okay.
like their tenants.
Yeah.
Oh,
They're
wow.
frightened of their tenants too. That's the other thing.
Mhm.
Mm.
Well, I think that one of the things you'd need people like AOC and the Squad and others who are the representatives of poor neighborhoods where people are doomed into awful housing, closed in with their families, who would push that all the landlords in New York City there. I remember a study I read where you could get $57 million just by selling off the housing that landlords didn't fix, even though there was a 5-year warning period. If you took over the people who didn't pay their taxes and the people who didn't make repairs, you would have a whole lot for collective housing, and then
Mm.
make it collective, not inherited, but collective, and help people work together to maintain it. And I think about how, in the 40s, the Communist Party, when people were evicted, would come right in and put their stuff back because there was an idea that housing was a human right. And I wonder what
Mm.
happened to that idea. Maybe it was just labeled as a suspect commie idea. I don't know. But I think if
Maybe.
you did
Yeah.
that, you could also have education of people that
Mm.
this is their house together.
Yeah, sometimes I forget about the 30s and 40s stuff. Maybe whenever tenants unions are doing eviction defense, they should wear MAGA hats to just
Yeah, disguise.
make the point. Well, just to make the point, just
Right.
be like,
That's
hey,
a good
we're
idea.
just going back to the 40s, man.
To
We're
the
just
where
doing eviction defense.
It's a great idea. Also in New
Yeah.
York, around the 30s and 40s, there was so much cooperative housing being built. Big co-ops where people cooperated and had all sorts of programs for their kids and everything else. There
Mm.
was an exhibit about it in the New York City Historical Museum about all the co-ops everywhere.
Mm.
And so even if you just took over the buildings of the people who won't pay their taxes and won't repair their building, you'd have a lot of space for co-ops in New York.
Mm. Mm.
But I think they'd have to be a platform of a political group that valorizes taking care of your own, not just being your own
Mm.
tiny family, but your own people that work together. It's a
Right.
different view.
Well, I like how we just sort of just got into housing policy. We're like, how do we? I mean, Bernie's. I only remember a couple bullet points off it, but one of Bernie's thing was like federal rent control.
Mm-hmm.
His housing platform.
Yeah, it was
I mean,
great.
that seems like a pretty. I think it was also yeah. There was also lots of reinvestment into high quality public housing. I mean, it does seem to me like we need that kind of, as I almost keep forgetting that the election's coming up, but it's like I feel like we can collectively agree like Biden's not going to do anything for housing.
Of
Yeah.
course, yeah.
If he
Unless
gets,
he's
I mean, if he
forced.
gets elected, right? Like, well, he could be forced more easily than Trump, but I mean, maybe Trump's like a coin toss and everything. Like, maybe you could actually force Trump into that. I don't know. Um,
Well, he does like
Evangelical.
building tall buildings, and tall buildings will help us with the housing problem.
Yeah,
yeah,
although he likes to build them for himself, himself
Yeah.
that's true.
and his
I know.
money-making buddies.
I know, and just get like
Uh,
four to five stories just for like the goons.
yeah,
Well, maybe that's the idea. Maybe this is the solution is just occupy Trump buildings and turn them into public housing. That's the moral of the story.
yeah. Well, I
Yep.
think, yeah. Now that people have all voted to take his name off the front because they weren't his buildings anyway, he just got his name on it for 10 grand.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
but I think that since the family's kind of breaking down as people are stuck in their family,
Mhm.
shelter in place, people are much more open to alternatives and
Mhm.
cooperative alternatives because they're alone.
Mhm.
Even if they're living in an apartment building, they're alone in a
Mhm.
way that is terrifying. And a lot of people are going mad on account of it, as we know as therapists.
I'm thinking, Harriet, and maybe Justin, you could help us with this if you know anybody. Like maybe we should continue this, because one problem I think we all agree here on is that most people don't really even know where to start with the solutions to the housing crisis,
That's
and
right.
it's really hard to like reverse the effects of the propaganda of the last 70 years of just like home ownership in the suburbs is the answer. You just
Mm,
somehow figure that out and you do it and magic happens.
yeah.
That there's all these other kind of ways that housing can work. Um, and they are, I think the difficulty, I have a like a progressive urban planner friend who I remember one time I kind of like nudged her into like, hey, why don't we just get next time we're all at the bar with our friends or whatever, give a little mini presentation on such and such thing. And she was like, yeah, we'll try it. And we found within 5 minutes, like everyone's eyes were glazing over and they were like going to get another drink. They're like, I have no
Yeah.
idea what you're talking about,
Right.
because housing policy is like super wonky. Like that's, I think, the conundrum, right? Like
Yeah. Because
the well, the beauty of the 1950s stuff, it was just like it was just bullshit. It was just propaganda. It was like get a home and a car and your wife and your 5 dogs and
right.
like that's it. It was just simple stupid imagery, and there was like government subsidy to help
That's right.
people
See
live
that.
that fantasy.
Yeah.
But like
That's
now it's
right.
like we don't, not only do we not have the government push, but like it's actually more, since these are actually like policy regulation type thing, like you couldn't actually propaganda your way into getting people into cooperatively owned apartments because there's no cooperative, you can't, you actually have to build them, you know what I mean? And you have
Right.
to like Justin saying, you have to change the zoning laws and all this shit where you can't just like snap people's brain into place and be like, oh, that thing. There actually needs to be either massive education for a lot of people to like start to move toward the solutions, or you need to like take over the government and force the government to just like do it.
Well,
And both of those options are incredibly difficult to pull off.
The power of homeowners, I guess, can't be overestimated here. One of the problems with like the propaganda aspect, how do we propagandize for uh, cooperative housing, non-single family housing, is like even the private sector hasn't figured this out yet. I know that like we, on the left, like a lot of people like to, hate on the yimbys all the time, right? And they're arguing for more private housing, right? And
Mm.
and the thing is, which is not even that bad of a solution, right? But there's no political momentum to like even allow private developers to build housing.
right.
Mm.
There's the
Yeah.
propagandizing is very very difficult even for the bad people.
Mm. Hmm.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
imagine so, but the subprime mortgage crisis might be helpful.
Yeah.
All those people who bought the dream and then bought bankruptcy and destruction.
I mean, well, I can't speak on this too much. There's like legal shit here, but like our landlord, so where our rent where we live is actually like very below market rate, which, and by the way, market rate is a bullshit term. Anyone listening, the real estate industry defines what that term means. But anyway, it's way below market rate where we live. Um, but part of it is he's been fighting that. So ever since the mortgage crisis of, I mean, whatever sparked, what was it, 2008? He's been basically
2008.
fighting like basically they've been trying to fuck him over ever since. For like the details are beyond me, and it's his legal battle, not ours. Like we're just paying him rent, but
Yeah.
like he's one of many homeowners who have been, I mean, I think most of them probably already lost their homes, but that's the other thing, is that you could, well, this is a sort of different conversation, but um a debate I've had with a couple of my tenant union buddies is that sometimes they're just like, we don't need to vilify like homeowners. Like homeowners are just as fucked as we are by the banks a lot of the time, and they're being swindled in a
Mm,
similar way. Like the level of precarity maybe isn't as extreme as for us as tenants, but figuring out a more, and I think this is where like the cooperative stuff is a little bit more attractive, where you could say like, oh, hey, homeowner, what if like it was like this and it was cooperatively owned and stuff like that, and then you wouldn't have to on your own do all that stuff, and like maybe
right.
some homeowners would say, actually, that sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah.
um but
Some
anyway,
people
but
just want
that's
to own their home for the sake of owning their home rather than for the
right.
sake of an investment. Sometimes you just want to be able
Right.
to build a deck without having to ask your landlord first.
Right.
Well, and like it's nice to not, I'm 35 and I've been paying. I don't know if I'll ever own shit. I grew up in a Section 8 that like in a sort of. I don't know when I was a kid if we were all on Section 8 vouchers in this big complex or if it's public housing. I always say it's a Section 8 housing project. I don't even know if that's probably not policy correct. But like that's how I grew up. I'm never gonna own, probably never gonna own shit. And so I've been renting forever, and like I'll have these conversations with other people that hit their like say mid-30s like me, and they're just like, I've been paying rent to these pieces of shit for my whole life. Like, wouldn't it be better to just own something so you don't do that? But it's just, but then the tragedy from there is like, well, to do that, you actually have to just pay a bank forever. And like eventually you kind of own it. But at that point, there's all these like maintenance, there's all this other crap that you didn't really foresee happening.
Right.
And there's like property taxes and crap like that.
And you also may not own it because the bank could take it back if you hit adversity. There's
Right,
only
exactly.
people that are so wealthy that they can buy it outright, which if you think of a country where 60% of the people don't have $400, that's not going to be a big phenomenon.
Plus you get better investment returns from an index fund every time.
What's an index fund? Give us the answers, Justin. The answers.
Oh, I mean, like, you know, if you're depending on your house for your retirement fund, that's not going to provide you as good returns as if you just put it in a 401k or an IRA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's just thinking for retirement here.
Yeah.
Investment advice for the leftists.
I got to start thinking about that soon. Well, okay. So we have, are single family homes bad? Did we come to that conclusion? Because I feel like it's a little more nuanced than that, but.
Of course.
Justin, are single family homes bad? You're on the record here.
Give us the truth. Go on the record as saying some single family homes are bad. Like if you own, a big McMansion that's 40 miles away from the city and you commute in an SUV into town every single day, that's bad.
Yeah.
If you own if you live in I don't know, a cute little row house in South Philly, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not wasting resources, and you're not, the idea is, I think, and here's where Americans really do have to change. The idea of looking out for your own shouldn't just be your own self or your own family. It should be looking out for the people around you and caring, and then the housing would follow. But I think that maybe our future in this consciousness and in putting family and housing and other basic needs on a political agenda is through a progressive movement, which then will get its ideas out.
If you're doing a Green New Deal for housing, you are absolutely building more dense housing. You are absolutely, and you're doing that honestly in the most expedient way possible. So that may not be like the government builds all of it. That may be,
private
God
builders.
forbid a developer comes in and builds a 6-story building in your neighborhood. Lots of people are against that on principle. Some for, political reasons. Well, some from like a leftist reason because, they're extracting profit or whatever. And some people are against it because, my God, the value of my house might go down.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
If you're rezoning a place for denser development and it's like Palo Alto, California, right? What you're really doing there is not is just you're not. What you're doing there is more about breaking the power of homeowners to make their real estate values go up than it is, some kind of health and safety regulation.
Right. So I guess what you're telling us is look, you have to look at the context and the meaning in the context. So that it's, these blanket rules based on principles that don't apply to the local situation are useless.
Yeah.
It has to be tied in, I think, with reclaiming the family for the left and reclaiming personal life for the left and not ceding that to the right, whose idea of housing is everybody for, every little family group, because they assume that there's a family when usually there isn't. They have, the red states, by the way, have even more divorces than the blue states, but that every little group huddles down as a separate unit, unaware of those around them. and that's what we need to change with the cooperation of the progressive elements that are out there and want to help. And this is such an important part. Housing is such an important personal issue.
Right, right. Well, and that, when we talk about mental health, it's like that's where, if you're living alone and you're super depressed, like that built environment, like that housing thing is a factor. If you're a couple of kids and you're getting like neglected or abused by your parents all the time in a single family home where no one ever makes contact with you, like that housing situation is a total contextual thing, right? Like
Right.
you can't remove from the quote unquote mental health symptom stuff that we're, you know, paid to pretend like we're experts in all the time. Um, but yeah, this is just one of those. The frustrating conclusion is like, well, it's the context. You just have to
Yeah.
keep understanding the context. It's just like everything else,
But you
So
also have to keep understanding that one of the reasons that people's views are so right wing and limited is because the right has been ceded this territory by the left, and we have to take it
right.
back. And Justin's work is a very important part of that, of informing us so we can
Mm.
take it back.
That's to
Yeah.
me is like even in that propaganda thing of like how you like, dang, how do we do that? Like, how do you reclaim family so it's not a right wing thing?
Well,
You
I
know?
think that would be much easier than it used to be because, especially with COVID, where people are cooped up with their family, they're mighty critical. And the majority of marriages now end in divorce. And you ask any adolescent if they'd rather live with their family or live with a bunch of other kids, they would tell you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
even if they're younger, they would tell you that. And partly it's the isolation. You know, I'm old. So when I was a little girl, I lived in a bourgeois New York City apartment. But because drugs hadn't flooded life yet, I used to go around and visit all sorts of people. And it was all right. There was a
Mm-hmm.
sense that we're all in the building. They knew who I was, I knew who they were. And I could go in and they'd give me hot chocolate and talk for them a little while till they told me to leave, or I felt like leaving. But there was more of a, also at that time in the 50s, there was the sense of a left that hadn't been extinguished by McCarthyism yet, and a
Mm-hmm.
collectivity which we have to bring back. And I think people are bringing that back. People like AOC and the whole squad are bringing it back. And that
And
we just have to add this element.
and like, even just, you can achieve, this feeling of community even with like moderately dense housing. Like I
Yeah.
live in a row house that's been, or a, a large Victorian row house has been converted into a few apartments, and like, as a result, we got a front porch where I can sit out there. Sometimes I talk to my neighbors. You sort of forced to interact with people even if you don't want to, because I'm kind of a hermit. But I interact with my neighbors. They we talk to each other. They forced me to put up a Biden sign. Um,
Yeah.
because like I'm not gonna be like, oh well, let me explain my nuanced view on Biden. And I was like, no, I'll put up a sign, whatever.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
You're part of the group,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
which makes sense.
Yeah.
At any
Huh.
rate, it's a sense of wanting to build community wherever you are.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm in New York City, I live in a co op, which when we first got there was really a co op. We ran the whole building. And then a woman came in who was very corporate, and values started going up in New York City. So instead of the kind of people that used to be there, they're rich people who want other people to work for them and they don't even want to see what work, just carry on, work for me, you're invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's a management company that does it rather badly and is more expensive.
I wonder, like, when that building was built, because I've been wondering about, especially since doing a lot of like tenant organizing these days, and I like look at buildings differently now, and like, I wonder how much it cost back then when that building. I mean, just when like Co-op City was built in New York, and like all
Yeah.
I only know like the surface level of it, but like
Mhm.
how much did it actually cost? What were the regulations and all that? I mean, because like the NIMBYs didn't exist then, I'm pretty sure, right?
Oh
So
no,
like,
you still had them. You just
oh
had
really?
Co-op City was built with a lot of union money that doesn't exist anymore because it's
Right.
illegal for
Oh,
unions to have that much money.
oh wow.
And also because America, as part of its anti-communism, wiped out a lot of the sparks in the union, the lefties. So,
Oh, we didn't even talk
there's
about we didn't
so
talk
they
about that then. I mean, is it, is the propaganda we need to get back? I mean, is that just more unions? you know?
well, that will help.
Um,
Unity of every kind and connection of every kind will help.
yeah.
And I think
Hmm.
that is starting. There's more organization and more strikes and more
Hmm.
protest of people together than there has been for 50 years.
Hmm.
So Americans are getting ready to think collectively. I mean, in this
Yeah.
town that I live in, which is very tiny, there's gazillions of Black Lives Matter signs, even though there's one black family in the whole place. But
Hmm.
just that we're connected and you can't treat people that way. And people have
Hmm.
signs, everyone is welcome. We are all human beings. Racism is
Hmm.
not welcome. Be kind. You know, it's a consciousness raising that I think is going across this country and should be
Hmm.
built on.
I appreciate that optimism.
But I would say the one thing you got to watch out for is when people have those signs up, about hate has no home here, immigrants welcome, and
Yeah.
then they show up in those same people show up in mass to go protest an affordable apartment building or something like that. It's
It
real
could be.
common.
It could be. It could be because one is abstract and one is concrete.
Yeah, one is
Well,
concrete. Well, we're gonna put those
The
people here
concrete
in your
up.
neighborhood. Oh,
well, that's
I didn't know they
well,
were gonna be
yeah.
here.
Right, right.
Well, yeah, in the neighborhood I live in, we have a lot of the liberal, we have, yeah, Biden signs and rainbow flags and Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. But I have a strong suspicion that a good chunk, if not the majority of them, would vote against a rent control, like in
Rent control. Ask them about what they
prop
think about a methadone clinic. Uh,
mm, to be built like in the neighborhood, right, right.
yeah,
So it's well, and that's where I rant about this sometimes. I do want to appreciate the um because it's a shame that the right came up with this term virtue signaling. 'Cause I do think it can be a useful term. I mean, this is like the dilemma of like it's not virtue signaling isn't bad like you're saying, Harriet. It's just sometimes it's just showing even if it's a sort of a fantasy of a collective
Yeah.
consciousness raising. At least it's since it's signaling maybe makes it more possible to actually get there. I mean, also from like a sort of organizing perspective, if you think this term like ladder of engagement, you might say like, oh well, if they're willing to put a Black Lives Matter sign up, maybe they're willing to go to the protest. If they're willing to go to the protest, maybe they'll donate money to this org. Maybe they'll serve as a co-chair on the committee or whatever. So
Maybe they'll
um,
they'll approve of the Section 8 housing in their area. You
right,
know,
exactly. Or they'll
As-
yeah.
come to like a surge meeting that's about the history of Section 8 or something because they're so
mhm,
dedicated to being anti-racist now or something, right? Like,
that's right. You
that's
can build
fine.
on what there is. Anyway, I think this is a good positive note on which to end, but you've opened a lot of doors.
Yeah, I actually have to go work on a banner drop for the tenants union right now, so I'm gonna need
Good.
to go design that. Uh, Sort of on topic, I suppose. Um,
yeah.
Justin, do you you want to plug any of the more recent projects you've been working on YouTube or
Um.
elsewhere?
So I'm a host on the podcast. Well, there's your problem. It's a podcast about engineering disasters with slides and jokes. Check that out. It's on Podbean. It's on anywhere fine podcasts are sold. It's on YouTube as well, so you can look at the slides.
So say the
Um,
name again for people who
it's,
wanted to write it down.
yeah, it's well, there's your problem.
It's great.
And
It's
yeah,
exactly how you say it in the thing too.
my my YouTube series should be updating soon, so that's also happening.
Good.
Almost finished with the next episode of Franklin, and yeah, I guess that's it.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah,
Actually, just since we have you, the most recent thing you put up it was that panel on the Green New Deal of whatever that thing was. It was
yeah.
like astounding. I watched a lot of it. What are you kind of working with like a team on that stuff now? Like Green New
Uh,
Deal, built environment, like is that a thing or is that just a one-off?
that was a one-off.
Okay.
Yeah, we might do it again next year. We might not. I'm going to keep it shorter next year. I thought
Okay.
it ran a little long.
Drum roll, please.
Yeah.
All right. If you love us, go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. If you want to email us, hate mail, love mail, questions, comments, if you want to be interviewed on this podcast, email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com.